Hey, so I've got merch now. If you're interested in the Killful Dinosaur shirt or hoodie or long sleeve, check out the top link in the description below. Thank you and enjoy the video. Last year, I made a video that was dedicated to the very niche and small subgenre of dinosaur western movies, of which there have only been a few over the decades. Sometime after that video was made, it was brought to my attention that some of the information regarding the upbringing of the earlier film examples, that being The Beast of Hollow Mountain and Valley of Gwangi, were incorrect, and that I was actually missing a movie on the short list of dinosaur westerns. That movie that I missed is called Emilio and His Magical Bull, and it actually kind of makes sense why I missed this title the first time around. Not only is this film pretty obscure on its own, but it's also just a rare one in general as well. There's actually quite a bit to this story about this movie that also connects to The Beast of Hollow Mountain and the Valley of Gwangi, as one of the things that all three of these films have in common is that they were all conceived by Willis O'Brien. And another thing they all have in common is that even though they were conceived by him, he never actually worked on any of them. But we'll get to that in a bit. Before I start, there is something I quickly want to address. Since my last video on dinosaur western movies, I have been able to come across better sources that have a more comprehensive retelling of the story of these different movies, and because of this, my goal is to try to recount the backstory of all three of these movies as chronologically as possible. However, it's become clear to me that there might still be some things here and there throughout the story that might be conflicting with one another, or might lack certain context or information that I unfortunately won't be able to answer myself. It's mainly little things, but just keep in mind that at the end of the day, this is a video about an old story about old movies that have been recounted several times over the years by several people involved with the projects. So naturally, there might be some misrememberings or different versions of the story that might muddle things up a little bit. That being said, I think you'll still get a solid idea of how everything came to be with The Beast of Hollow Mountain, The Valley of Gwangi, and Emilio and His Magical Bull. So with that, let's take a look at the story behind these movies. The idea of a dinosaur western movie was conceived by Willis O'Brien in the early 1940s. Considering O'Brien's very obvious interest in prehistoric life, given his filmography with dinosaurs up to this point, and the fact that this was right around the time of the golden age of American western films, it would be no surprise that O'Brien would want to combine these two concepts together in the way he knew best, through stop-motion animation in a feature-length project. In 1941, Willis O'Brien and film producer John Speaks would develop a more extensive version of the idea for a movie they were making for RKO and Colonial Pictures. During this point in time, I believe the movie simply went under the title of Gwangi, and progress for it was being made. A script was made for it, along with hundreds of concept images, the cast and director were in the process of being selected, and some of the props and dioramas for the scenes were being made. In this original story, it was going to be about a group of cowboys who venture into the Grand Canyon only to discover an Allosaurus living there. Seeing an opportunity to profit off of such a find, the cowboys rope and subdue the animal and take it back into town, where they feature it in a Wild West attraction they call Gwangi. But this ends up failing as Gwangi ends up escaping, fighting some lions, and wreaking havoc to the nearby town. But the dinosaur is ultimately killed after being forced off a cliff by a vehicle. At this point in time, O'Brien had actually invited his protege and friend, Ray Harryhausen, to the set to see how production was coming along. According to Harryhausen, $50,000 had been financed for the film, and the studio gave O'Brien a year to finish it. It was here O'Brien would also give Harryhausen a copy of the screenplay for Gwangi. Unfortunately, the idea was shelved, possibly for a number of reasons. It was possibly due to the change in management at RKO that was happening at the time, them losing faith in the concept of a dinosaur western movie. Maybe it was the interference of World War II. It could be a number of things, but based on what I've read, O'Brien was never given a proper reason, and the production for Gwangi would end up getting cancelled. But O'Brien didn't give up on his desire to make a dinosaur western movie, because around the mid-1940s, he and his wife would come up with another story, which was meant to be an outline for a movie. The outline that Willis O'Brien and his wife Darlene Prennett O'Brien would work on was called Emilio and Guloso. There wasn't much to the outline, just that its main character would be Emilio and that the monster of the film was simply referred to as a giant lizard. However, the O'Briens would expand the outline into a full-on story, which would be retitled to El Toro Estrella, which translates to the Star Bull, and the movie would focus on Emilio and a group of natives that travel into a lost hidden world within a valley that contains prehistoric life within it. Things like pterodactyls and triceratops and a pair of allosauruses. The end of the movie would feature one of those allosauruses in battle with Emilio's Star Bull as our main character and his companion fight to save the people of their village from the rampant dinosaur. The movie would continue to be fleshed out even more and would once again be retitled, this time to Valley of the Mists. From my understanding at this point in the story, Valley of the Mists was being thought out during the point in time Willis O'Brien was also working as a special effects supervisor on another movie called Mighty Joe Young, a story about a young woman who raises an infant gorilla in East Africa who grows into the oversized Joe Young. In this movie, there are certain scenes and plot details that play out that were actually a part of O'Brien's original screenplay for Gwangi. For example, there's a scene where Joe Young is fighting a group of cowboys, which was basically going to be the same scene that would have played out in Gwangi, except of course in this movie, instead of a large theropod dinosaur, it was a large gorilla. After Mighty Joe Young was released, the film was pushed towards Oscar consideration for its technical and special effects department, led by Willis O'Brien and worked on by Ray Harryhausen, leading to this copy of the release that states this. What it also states is Willis O'Brien's next movie venture, as it says, now preparing Valley of the Mists for Jesse L. Lasky Productions at the bottom of their names. Lasky was a pretty well-known movie producer at the time and would actually be one of the founders of a little pretty little known American film production company, which is today known as Paramount Pictures. So yeah, all jokes aside, this was a pretty big deal. Finally, O'Brien had secured a production studio that was willing to help him make his Dinosaur Western film. And based on what I've read, it seemed like he was really going to deliver in a great movie, as at one point he said Valley of the Mists was going to be the grand follow-up to Mighty Joe Young. And although Mighty Joe Young didn't do that well in the box office, it did win an Academy Award for its visual effects and was pretty well received, it seems. However, when it comes to O'Brien and his Dinosaur Western movie, it just seems like it wasn't meant to be, because in 1950, Lasky Productions would end up dropping the Valley of the Mists film project as they didn't have the money for it at the time. But all hope didn't seem lost quite yet, because in the same year, a certain pair of brothers would make their way onto the scene and play a big role in this story. In the same year of 1950, a pair of Syrian brothers and movie producers, Edward and William Nassours, would catch wind of O'Brien's Dinosaur Western film project and were very interested in it. They've worked in the film industry for a little while at this point, with the only recognizable movie, to me at least, that they've worked on was Lost Continent from 1951. Apparently, Edward had a passion for stop-motion animation and loved O'Brien's idea, so they ended up purchasing the rights for it. More specifically, they purchased the rights to the screenplay for Emilio and Guloso, which I guess in turn got them the rights to Valley of the Mists, since the Valley of the Mists was just an expanded and retitled version of Emilio and Guloso. But I mention this because the Nassours brothers would end up taking both of these iterations of O'Brien's movie concepts and using elements of both for two completely different projects, at least later on. But at this point in the early 50s, it seems like the brothers were more trying to focus on one thing, and that they were trying to have O'Brien on board on the project as they asked him to basically go back to his original idea and expand on it more. It seems like they were also looking for studios to pitch their idea for, one of them being King Brothers Productions, but not much seems to have come from this meeting, at least at first. Now, I'm not really sure how accurate some of these events are, and the sources I'm using aren't too specific about them. Based on what I have though, it kind of tells two different versions of this next part. One version that I read, which I ended up getting from a blog site called the House of Fradkin-stein, which seems to be all about documenting the history of film and TV, says that the Nassours had O'Brien expand his original story and make some changes along the way that would essentially become the 1956 title, The Beast of Hollow Mountain. In this other version of the story, which I got from different segments in the Dinosaur Filmography book, it says that after the Nassours purchased the rights from O'Brien, they renamed the movie to Ring Around Saturn before changing it once again to Emilio and His Magical Bowl, which was going to be fully animated, but after a couple of years, all progress for this movie would end up stopping and the Nassours would take a hiatus from working on it, leaving it unfinished. Then, in the mid-50s, O'Brien would bring back the idea of a dinosaur western movie, but this time it would be a completely different story under the new title of The Beast of Hollow Mountain. In this story, it was going to be about two cattlemen, Hank Oliver and Jim Larkin, who are rivals. Oliver ends up getting murdered and Larkin is suspected given the hostility known between them. However, Larkin knows something no one else does, which is the fact that he's seen a giant prehistoric reptile around the area, most likely responsible for the murder of Oliver. Of course, no one believes him, but before he could face the consequences for the crime he didn't commit, he's saved by Sheriff Dean Roberts and his Native American partner, John Longtooth. The trio go after the creature and manage to trap it at one point, but it escapes and terrorizes a nearby village before they're able to subdue and possibly even kill the creature for good. It's not actually specified whether they fully kill the creature or not, but I assume they do given the kind of movie it is. And that's not all. In this second, longer version of the story, the Nassours were also interested in O'Brien's Beast of Hollow Mountain story and purchased the rights for this project as well for a small amount of money. And with Edward telling O'Brien that once the production for the movie got off the ground, he could help out with the film as well by overseeing the special effects process. However, when time came around for production to start, Edward rejected the idea to bring O'Brien on board for the project and decided to manage the stop-motion process himself, as he was also very interested in this field of work. As a result, O'Brien's only credit for the movie was coming up with the idea for it and not for any of the special effects work done for it. So yeah, those are the two different versions of the story that I heard about. Personally, I'm more inclined to believe in the second version given where it came from. Eventually, The Beast of Hollow Mountain would finally be made and released in 1956. The movie was different than O'Brien's original concepts, this time being around a white rancher in Mexico struggling to keep his ranch afloat as he deals with keeping up with bills, a love triangle with the woman he loves and the caballero that she plans to marry, and of course the titular monster that's been eating his cattle. When the monstrous tyrannosaur finally shows itself in the final quarter of the movie, our main character leads it to quicksand where the T-Rex slips and sinks into, killing the monster for good. But 1956 was also the release of another movie called The Brave One, which was released by King Brothers Production, the company that I had mentioned earlier when the Nassours were trying to pitch their idea for a dinosaur western movie about a boy and his bull several years earlier. What was suspicious about this was that The Brave One was also about a young Mexican boy and his pet bull, which Edward and William saw as the King Brothers production company stealing their idea that they had pitched to them years prior, and as a result, there was a $750,000 lawsuit. The following year, in 1957, the case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, ending that conflict. But going back to The Beast of Hollow Mountain, as far as I can tell, this would be the only iteration of a Western dinosaur movie that O'Brien would ever get to see. Because some years later, in November of 1962, he would unfortunately pass away. Despite all of his attempts to make a dinosaur western movie, he unfortunately never did. The closest he ever got was his very first attempt with RKO, managing to get to the pre-production phase of the film, and the one film that did manage to see the light of day that was conceived by him was the one that he wasn't able to work on outside of expanding the story for it. But this still wasn't the end of the line for O'Brien's Dinosaur Western film. Finally, we have Valley of Gwangi. During the late 60s, while Ray Harryhausen was doing some cleaning around his house, he stumbled upon something very familiar in his garage. It was the script for Gwangi that O'Brien had given him all those years ago when he was first working on the movie for RKO Pictures. Harryhausen would take time reading through it, and while he said it was slow in some parts, he saw the potential in it for a feature film. He also stated that he hated the idea that it would never be made, so he took the opportunity to show the script off to one of his partners, producer Charles Schneer. After reading the script, he too saw the potential in a sci-fi adventure movie, and the two wasted no time. They obtained the rights and got to work. They worked on making the story better paced. They included pretty much all of the action sequences that take place in the original script, while making some minor changes along the way. They got the cast and crew together, having Jim O'Connelly set to direct it, and they searched for movie production studios, offering it to anyone that might be interested, which ultimately fell into Warner Brothers' lap. In the original script, there was a pterodactyl attack that felt more brief. The Allosaurus fights and kills a Triceratops. In the end, after wreaking havoc to the town, Gwangi is led to a cliff edge and is hit off after one of the main characters drives a car into it, and so on. The end product shows a group of cowboys and showrunners venturing into a forbidden valley in search of a little prehistoric horse, which should surely be perfect for an attraction and reel customers in. However, as they venture deeper into the valley trying to find the little horse, they run into all kinds of prehistoric animals, including Struthiomimus, Styracosaurus, a pteranodon, and of course, the purple Allosaurus itself, Gwangi. The group is able to rope and knock out the large carnivore, where they take it back into town and use it for a grand attraction for their circus show, but this ends up failing as Gwangi is broken out of its cage and it wreaks havoc across the city before being led and trapped inside a cathedral that's then set on fire. Soon Gwangi succumbs to the flames and is crushed by the debris of the building. Despite its long and troubled history, the final product was finally here, and yet it was still not enough for it to be successful during its time, as it was a complete box office failure. Apparently, this was primarily due to Warner Brothers not giving the movie enough publicity or marketing. It would literally be playing in theaters, but there would be very few people who'd go and actually see it because the majority of them didn't even know it existed. Much to Harryhausen's frustration, according to him, he thinks people would have loved this movie. And had it not been for the lack of marketing and the point in time the movie was released in, it probably would have done well. At the point in time that Gwangi was finally released, it was nearing the end of the 60s, and a new era of film was emerging that was more open and less restrictive. Compared with what was to come and what was already playing at the time, The Valley of Gwangi was probably just too straightforward and safe of a film for people, which to an extent, yeah, that makes sense. A lot of what you see in Valley of Gwangi, you also see in some of the older monster movies as far back as things like the original King Kong and The Lost World. People visit an uncharted region that contains prehistoric life where they manage to bring one of the creatures back before it eventually gets loose, causes destruction, and eventually gets killed or goes back to its homeland. People have seen it before for many years before Valley of Gwangi, and for the time, it probably just wasn't that interesting to people. But maybe in its day, Valley of Gwangi wasn't appreciated. However, as time went on, more and more people began to realize its production value and potential as a fun sci-fi adventure. Today, the movie has gained quite a following, with some people praising it as one of the best dinosaur movies ever created. And as great as it was that O'Brien's Dinosaur Western movie finally came to fruition, albeit 7 years too late, this still isn't the end of the story. So going back to the 50s, the Nassours would return to an old project that they had put on the back burner. Now, it's not specified when exactly they got back to it, but apparently the Nassours would continue working on their Emilio and the Magical Bull project, and from my understanding, they managed to finish most, if not all of the production for it. But it's clear this was more of a long-term project for the brothers, as they had other things to work on during that point in time, so it wasn't unlikely that they were probably on and off off of the project. Unfortunately for Edward Nassours, he wouldn't get a chance to see the movie 100% complete, as he would die in 1962. Apparently, it wasn't until after Edward's death that William would once again return to their animated movie and work on its post-production phase throughout the 60s, and considering the movie's 1975 release, I think it's safe to say that this was still a project that William was off and on about. Now, I don't have a whole lot of information about the time period between 1962 and 1975, but according to the Dinosaur filmography, in the early 70s, Nassours would be approached by a couple of producers, Martin B. Cohen and Martin Nosek, who had heard about their Dinosaur Western, Emilio and His Magical Bull, and they had a desire to see it completed and provided Nassours and his team the funds to do so. So with this, William was finally able to complete the rest of the film, and on December 17th, 1975, Emilio and His Magical Bull premiered at the Pickwood Theater in Westwood, California. The movie takes place in a town near San Esteban where whimsical Mexican farm boy Emilio resides with his father, who isn't too mindful of his son's childlike fantasies and instead has him go take their calf to the marketplace in town to sell. But this was probably not the smartest choice to make, because on the way, Emilio runs into a persuasive salesman with a baby bull that he tries to trade for his calf by saying the bull has magical powers, which is enough to convince Emilio to make the trade, much to his father's anger when he finds out. But then a dream sequence plays out one night of Emilio and his magical bull on a fantastical adventure in a prehistoric setting. Then an Allosaurus appears that the star bull has to fight. Apparently, in the movie, the Nassours brothers used a different form of stop-motion animation for the Allosaurus scene specifically. This different form of stop-motion was called replacement animation, and it was a technique that they actually used for their dinosaur when they were working on the Beast of Hollow Mountain. Basically, in normal stop motion, you'd typically have one articulate model that you'd move little by little for each frame. In replacement animation, multiple models of the same figure are made in slightly different positions, and in every frame, one model is replaced by another model of a slightly different pose, and the process is repeated several times so that when the frames are put together, it looks like it's making fluid motion. Anyway, back to the story, the Star Bull is able to hold its own and defeats the deadly Allosaurus, which is where the dream ends. Back in the real world, a famous matador named Senor Garza hears about the magical Star Bull and offers to buy it off of Emilio and his father. Emilio obviously was against this offer, but he doesn't get a say in this deal as his father ends up accepting it. That night, Emilio goes after Senor Garza to make him another offer, but quickly realizes through the words of others that no matter what deal he tries to make with Garza, he was not honest enough to keep it. Garza had purchased Emilio's bull because he wanted to fight it in the ring, but on the day of the bullfight, Emilio's bull is able to hold its own during the fight. He also manages to chase off Garza and reunites with his friend, which is where the movie ends. Yeah, there's not a whole lot to it, and the dinosaur appearances are pretty minimal in the overall story, at least based from what I've heard, but this was apparently only a 45-minute film, so it makes sense that the plot would be even more simple than its original concept. Unfortunately, from the very start, this film was very obscure, only playing in select theaters, and even after its decent reception, the film would kind of just disappear. It doesn't seem like it had any kind of home media release, nor was it properly archived anywhere that's at least easily accessible to the general public. One post in 2018 from another blog site that I ran into during my research for this video called My 50 Most Wanted Films briefly references an auction that not only held the DVD to the movie, but also other materials from its production. However, the link they provided is now dead and wasn't archived, so I couldn't tell you what all was included in this package. Aside from that, the film is now very rare. Hell, it could even be considered lost, since it's not like anyone knows whose hands the DVD ended up falling into. And what's left behind of the movie are only a few images, one depicting a pterosaur that briefly shows up in the dream sequence. We have a couple of pictures of the Allosaurus fighting the Star Bull, also from the dream sequence. And we have this one image of the characters, which I'm assuming might be Emilio and his family. It's a shame this one is rare and possibly even lost, because even if it was a lesser version of what Willis O'Brien was trying to create, it was ultimately the last Dinosaur Western movie that was conceived by him, and that in itself just shows how significant it really is. And that was the story of Willis O'Brien and his many attempts to create a dinosaur western movie, all of which had pretty much failed. Regardless, even if he wasn't there to see it, his movie would finally get made as good as it could possibly get thanks to the efforts of his protege Ray Harryhausen with Valley of Gwangi. And even if the movie didn't get enough praise during its time, it would eventually build up a following over the years. Hell, even the Beast of Hollow Mountain, which was pretty skimpy with their dinosaur appearance, would gain its own cult following, as at the end of the day, the production value wasn't all that bad. Unfortunately for Emilio and his magical bull, it seems to have become largely forgotten, and will most likely stay that way until some kind of re-release. Or I guess until someone just uploads the entire thing somewhere on the internet. But it's nice to know that a lot of this story is documented one way or another, and I'm happy that I was able to put everything together and tell that story here, even if there were some parts that were inconsistent or confusing. Again, at the end of the day, this is an old story that's been retold by many people many times. Some things are bound to be different or changed or misremembered. That being said, if you guys have any more information about these movies that I might have missed, do let me know in the comments down below. But that's all I have to say for now. Thank you all so much for watching, and please have a nice day.